So let's move on to section 2. We just had an episode where we discussed on different misconceptions this unknown author had about women and the consequences of sin and punishment at the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3. And I believe we gave the required information for the listeners to clearly understand why the premise in which they are built are not correct. And let's discuss now on a few misconceptions. And these we have categorized under a section with a heading like women as objects of rape. So there are a few questions, or I would rather say assumptions this author has made, which according to her, she comes to a conclusion that women are depicted as objects of rape in Torah. So specifically, let's talk about Genesis chapter 19 and verse 8. Author refers to this scripture portion to talk about a man named Lot, who offers his daughters to a crowd of would-be angel rapists in the midst of the most wicked city at that time. So let's talk about Lot and his family now.
Yes, so as JMP, as you mentioned, Lot is, as we know, nephew of Abraham. He was living in the city called Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom and Gomorrah was the most vile city, one of the most wicked city ever, because of the immoral sexual practices that were so common and so rampant in that city. And God sent his messengers, in fact, to destroy that city. And it is in this context that the messengers were taken to Lot's home. He opened his home for them, and he was being a very hospitable host to them. And he was, engaging them in his house and entertaining them. And
like
at this time,
like I was about to say, like any Middle Eastern person during that time, and even now, Easterners are one of the most hospitable people, right?
That's right. So in this context, we see that the men of the city, they call and they come to Lot's door asking for the angels to be given to be raped. Of course, that's an extremely immoral and vile thing to ask for. But Lot, instead of permitting that, he's offering his daughters. Is Lot right in doing that? Absolutely not. Lot, as a father, had responsibility to protect his daughters. So in no way we are justifying what Lot did, nor is God on Lot's side. How do we know that? Because the angels, in fact, protect Lot's daughters. The angels strike these men who are at the door, and they become blind, and they are no longer able to do anything. And the angels, or the messengers from God, they protect Lot's daughters. So where an earthly father fails, God indeed does what is needed to protect these women. So that shows how gracious God is to all women.
Yeah. Again, this is another case of misreading into the text to make author's point. I would call it a classic eisegesis, rather than reading the next few lines into the story to see that the God of the Bible actually protected these women from being raped, right?
Yes.
So this is a powerful example that when an earthly father makes a bad choice and fails to protect his daughters, in this case, it's Lot, but the Heavenly Father doesn't, right? It's a beautiful thing. Yeah, I wish people read a little further than what they actually wanted to read. That would actually clarify a lot of questions.
That's right.
So let's continue on to this story. Seems like the story of Lot is quite popular with the author. Let's continue with the story of Lot. And this author of this article also mentions of God killing Lot's wife for simply looking back at the remains of a city. Was she simply looking back?
Okay, this is very interesting. Simply looking back, looks like such a small thing to do, and God is killing her for that. Now, we should understand that God was punishing the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. He was not obliged to save Lot and his family. But God, in his great mercy, is rescuing this family out of that city, probably as an answer to Abraham's prayer even. He's rescuing them out, and he has not given them anything else, any other command to do. The only thing that God's messengers tell this family to do is not to look back when they are being rescued. If you are in such a dire situation and you were to die and you're being rescued out, would you not follow a simple, as the author says, simple instruction that is given to you? That was the least that this family could do. That was the least she could do. And Lot's wife, it was not simply turning back, but she disobeys God's direct command to her. And she looks back and she becomes a pillar of salt. Now, it is not because Lot's wife turned back. If Lot or anyone else who had been given a command by God disobeyed it, they all would have equally suffered the consequence. So this is, again, not a sexism case. It is because Lot's wife turned back, she turned into a pillar of salt. Had it been anyone else, they would have. So it's not a simply turning back. It is disobedience, and the just, righteous God of the Bible would not let sin go unpunished. So that is the context where this happens.
Right. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you are a man or a woman. Exactly. There are consequences to sin, which is a willful disobedience to God's command, right? So the author's assumption that God is sexist because he punished Lot's wife is incorrect. As you mentioned, Lot's wife looked back, she turned to a pillar of salt. As you mentioned, I don't know if Lot would have looked back, he might have turned to a pillar of salt. We don't know. Glad that he didn't look back. But but allegations against him did not stop. Poor Lot had some more things to deal with. So the author goes on to say, not only this dad, Lot, offered his daughters to rapists, but he also impregnates his own daughters. So let's examine the story in Genesis chapter 19. I'll read Genesis chapter 19, verse 31 and 32.
Yes.
And the firstborn said to the younger, talking about Lot's daughters, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So that's what this scripture portion says, actually.
Exactly. So this portion, again, is not quoted by the author. So, I mean, that itself makes it very clear. This whole scheme or scheming was done by Lot's daughters. When probably Lot's daughters saw Sodom and Gomorrah burning down, and they thought there is no man left on earth to be their husbands or therefore to preserve their family line. Probably they were also influenced by the moral culture of the society of Sodom, for which Sodom was punished. So it did not seem a big deal for them to make this scheme to get pregnant by their father. So to say that Lot impregnated them is going too far, because Lot would not have done it had he been in his sense. But what happens here is the daughters make their father drunk. And as it always happens, even today, a drunk man does not know what he does. He loses his common sense. And then he does not make good choices, right choices. And thereby, his daughters lie with him and they become pregnant by their father. That is true. But who schemed this? The daughters. So to put the accusation on Lot, we are not in any way justifying what Lot did. What he did was wrong. To get drunk. Absolutely, it was wrong. It was absolutely wrong. But to put the accusation on Lot is not correct, because the entire scheming was done by the daughters.
Right, and this is a warning for all to take heed of. Right, God does not approve incest, as later given in the law. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 to 26 talks about this, and such relationships are abomination to the Lord. Just because Lot and his daughters slept, it doesn't mean that the God of the Bible is supporting this or commanding this. And so the context, in fact, is not Lot impregnating his daughters as the author claims, but these two women raping their own father by making him drunk with wine, right? So it's actually the other way around.
The other way around.
Right. Yes. So when we talk about rape, this word comes a lot, at least in our own nation, unfortunately. We often talk about women being victims, which is true. But we should
Absolutely.
also acknowledge that from ancient times, there are cases of male rape too. So sin is not
That's true.
specific to any gender, right?
That's right. That's
So
right.
as the punishment.
That is true.
Right. So as we wrap up this discussion on Lot's family, we have discussed about Lot offering his daughters to rapists and how God rescues them. And in no way
Yes.
God actually supports this. In fact, God rescues these women. And then we spoke about Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. She willfully disobeyed God and turned to a pillar of salt, and not because she's
That's right.
women. So there's no sexism there. And again,
That's
we talk
right.
about Lot impregnating his daughters, while it
Daughters.
was the
Yes.
daughters who schemed to preserve their
Family line.
family line, right?
That's right.
So even as we discussed all these, and as we wrap up this section of our discussion, I cannot fail to mention the providence of God and the rescue of Lot's family from Sodom and Gomorrah before it is
That's right.
utterly destroyed. Right, as
That's
you
right.
mentioned in your background explanation, that it is an act of God in response to
That's right.
Abraham's prayer in Genesis chapter 18, right? So unfortunately, the author misses that, but tries to mention something that is very convenient.
That's true.
Okay, so this is a new episode to discuss about misconceptions against women, or I would say sexism in Torah, as claimed by this unknown author on this website called evilbible.com. So we have seen this article called "Sexism in Torah," and Sherin, you and I, we looked into
Yes.
these different misconceptions this
That's
unknown author has put, and in the past few episodes, we have been discussing those misconceptions and trying to refute those claims with
That's right.
the evidence and the explanation of the text. So in this particular episode, we would talk about another family. You know, the families seems to be very popular in our discussion. Like we discussed
That's right.
about Lot's family. Now
Really.
we'll move on and discuss about the family of Judah.
That's right.
So the author of this article quotes Genesis chapter 38, verses 16 to 24, to mention the story of a man named Judah who lived
That's
with
right.
his widowed daughter-in-law. So the author claims that his daughter-in-law was a grieving widow, and she was wearing veils of mourning, which Judah, the author calls him a rather stupid man, maybe he was, I don't know, mistook for the clothing of a prostitute. He ended up, again, another question on impregnating. The author says Judah ended up impregnating his daughter-in-law, and she left the city. So let's take some time to examine this statement, Sherin.
Yes. So this again is a case where the entire background is not talked about. Just as you rightly mentioned, what is convenient to make a point, the point that she wants to convey, she has taken that part of the story that again is not told correctly, which we will see now. Now, because this is an interesting story, why don't we see what the background of the story is? Now, Judah, most people would know who Judah is. Yes, so Judah is the son of Jacob, one of the 12 sons, and Judah has 3 sons. So the older one is Er, his name is Er, and he was married to this woman called Tamar. And he dies because God kills him because he was a wicked man. So Er dies, and it was the custom in Israel that if a man dies without a child, then it was the responsibility of the man's brother to marry his brother's wife and thereby preserve the family line. So the second son of Judah, Onan, was supposed to now marry Tamar, which Judah gives Onan in marriage to Tamar. But Onan, again, he is a wicked guy too. He does not want to bring a child in order to preserve his brother's family line. Therefore, he refuses to give a child to Tamar. And God is absolutely displeased with this action. And God kills Onan. It's clearly stated in Genesis 38 what happens. God, in fact, punishes Onan because he failed his duty to Tamar. Tamar's rightful, the right to a child through Onan, he withheld. So therefore, God punishes Onan. So that itself shows us that God is no sexist. In fact, God is grieved with the fact that Tamar was denied her right and thereby preserve the family line. And so God comes into action and punishes Onan and strikes him dead. That is no silly matter. It's a very serious thing. So here, Tamar is favored by God and Onan is killed because he failed his duty to Tamar. So that is the background of the story. Now what should Judah do? Judah should give his third son, his name is Shelah, to Tamar. But now Judah is scared. Two of my sons were married to Tamar and both of them died. So even in some of our circles, we would have that fear. Oh, if my third son marries, then what would happen? So Judah thought my third son also would die. So he didn't want Tamar and Shelah to get married. So he asked Tamar to go back to her father's house and stay there till Shelah grew up. So that was under the assumption that when he grows up, I'll give you in marriage. But then Judah fails to do that. So first point is that when this incident happens, Tamar was not staying with her father-in-law. So that the author got wrong. Tamar was in her father's house in another town, and Judah was in his town.
Right. That's one incorrect statement there. And now let me read the following verses, which gives us the intent of Tamar's action. Genesis chapter 38 and verse 14. So she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot because she had covered her face. So again, Genesis chapter 38 verse 15 says, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute because she covered her face. So it's clear from the passage that it was not the widow's covering that Judah mistook for the prostitute's veil, right?
That's right. So intentionally here we see Tamar removing her widow's garments and putting on a prostitute dress. Of course, a widow's garment and a prostitute's veil is not going to be same or even similar. Absolutely. So there's a clear distinction there. She was no longer dressed up as a widow, but as a prostitute. And as you just now read, the intent behind this was very clear. When she came to know that her father-in-law was not going to give his son to her as husband, she wanted some kind of vengeance take, some kind of vengeance. So now I will show him what I can do, So some kind of intent, an evil intent is actually behind this action of Tamar. And therefore she dresses herself up as a prostitute, knowing that Judah is in town, has come to this town. And Judah, of course, did not recognize her because she had covered her face. And he does impregnate her, which is wrong. To lie down with a prostitute is definitely wrong. God condemns any such activity outside marriage. So the God of the Bible, again, does not support the action of Judah. What he did is absolutely wrong. And so was Tamar wrong. So it is not whether Judah was wrong or Tamar was wrong. In God's eyes, both did what was displeasing to him, and both are equally responsible for what happened. But to say that Judah impregnated Tamar is just a small portion of that story when Tamar had schemed the whole thing, just like how we saw in the case of Lot's daughters.
Right. So this is another case where the author ignores the fact that two men were struck dead by God as they did not fulfill the duty towards this woman.
That's right.
Tamar. But the fact that Tamar and Judah, her father-in-law, commit sin is highlighted conveniently, missing the point that it is Tamar who took the matter into her own hands. Right?
That's right.
So let's see what else has to this story. The author mentioned that on a later date, Judah sees this young woman again, which is Tamar, and demanded that she be burned for being a prostitute. And she makes a statement like, I like how only the women is punished when they both engaged in this sexual act. It wasn't until Judah recognized the woman as his daughter-in-law and she was with child, then he decided to kill her. So basically what the author is saying is Judah can commit incest, use a prostitute, even if he's mistaken perception, and he impregnated a much younger woman, yet he thinks she's the one deserving death. So that's right. That's the point this author is trying to put across.
Yes. Again, this is a historical account of what happened, and this fits in and supports the central theme of the Bible, that man is totally depraved and corrupted and could go to any length in his sinful behavior. Apart from grace and the mercy of God, we are all like Judah, because even now in our culture, in our society, you know, we find a small fault with someone else and we are quick to judge them, when we ourselves could be indulging in the same activity, in the same sin, like Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 7 quotes, when you have a log in your eye, you're busy taking out speck from your brother's eye. That's exactly what Judah did. Judah did exactly the same sin that Tamar has committed in this case, but he was quick to judge Tamar and call her out and, you know, judge her and even say that she should be burned, when he himself has done the same thing. Of course, no one knows except Tamar that he is the one, you know, who is the father of Tamar's child, you know, so that is something that's hidden at this point of time. But then one more thing we see is when Judah actually recognizes that it is Tamar and he is the one who went and, you know, impregnated her, then we see that Judah does not demand her burning. And then he also says that it is recorded that he did not go into her again. So this is not a case of incest actually, because Judah lied with Tamar when he did not realize that it was Tamar, because the moment he realizes it is Tamar, he does not have any other sexual relations with her. So we cannot actually classify this as a case of incest, because if he knew it was Tamar, he wouldn't have done it. Now, it does not make what he did right. You know, it is as sinful as it can be, and in God's eyes, both deserve rightful judgment.
Yeah. I mean, well said. In fact, the genealogy of Christ has women whose lives were far from ideal. As we look into the story, it is also significant that Tamar appears in the genealogy of Messiah, Christ, in Matthew chapter 1. This is an example how God elevates women who have lives, as I mentioned, far from perfect. And Jesus was gracious not only to be born into the bloodline, but make sure the names are mentioned in the genealogy. And with this, I would argue that it is actually the opposite of what sexism against women should be, right? The women with a shady background, women who made some wrong choices. They were actually shown grace, and some of them even found their names in the genealogy of Christ, right?
That is right. That is right.
So as we discussed the family of Judah and the claims that Judah and Tamar, Judah slept with Tamar, and it's in a case of incest. We refuted those claims, and we also discussed on the fact that it's not Judah that took the initiative, though he went and he thought he saw a prostitute, but it was his daughter-in-law, but it was Tamar who initiated this action, right? With this, we can wrap up our discussion to refute these pointers with respect to this story of Judah.
Yes.
Now, let's discuss a few questions. I would rather say not questions, accusations or wrong conclusions the author comes to with respect to sexism in slavery. You know, Torah and the slavery seems to be a very interesting and famous topic for a lot of them. So let's move on to discuss a few misconceptions that say Torah or the Bible promotes slavery. Specifically, Exodus chapter 21, which in fact has a heading, Laws About Slaves. So, for the author, Exodus 21, verse 3 to 4 says that if a male slave is given a wife by his master, regardless of how long they are wed, how much they love each other, or if they have kids, he cannot leave servanthood with his wife or children. The women and children are merely property of the master, and their personal happiness or sanctity of the family doesn't matter. So this is something that's concerning our unknown author now.
Yes. So before we delve into the exact passage and try to see what she's trying to say, the author, we should understand slavery in the ancient world. We know that slavery was rampant in the ancient world, and many people have this misconception that Bible, somehow is responsible for slavery. But the opposite is in fact true, because we know that the Israelites, the main characters in, the Torah of the Bible, are the people of Israel. They were slaves in Egypt for more than 400 years. So slavery was already existent. And in fact, Israelites were slaves. So we know that in no way Bible is responsible for bringing in slavery into the ancient culture. In fact, the contrary is true. In a time when slavery was rampant and slaves were mistreated, not at all valued, treated like animals or even worse than animals, and more slaves would die of bodily harm or hunger. And no one even cared for them, no one knew about them. They were worse than animals in that culture, in every culture of that time. But when we come to the Bible or to the Torah in Exodus 21, when God opens up giving laws about various things to the Israelites at Sinai, he starts off by saying, here are the laws regarding slaves.
Right.
That itself is a glorious, it's absolutely glorious that God is concerned about slaves whom no one is concerned about. And now God is giving some rules, some regulations, so that even slaves would have a dignified life, that their status would be elevated. So the Torah does acknowledge or knows that slavery is existent, and some kind of slavery would also be among Israelites, but this would be a death knell to the actual kind of slavery that was rampant. Rather, slavery in Israel would be distinct. It would be a rural, domestic work. It would be a small scale one. So, going forward, this would kind of abolish the kind of slavery that existed around, and rather give dignity to slaves and elevate them to a position or to a kind of life that they never had. So this is very interesting, that the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, is so concerned about slaves and is now going to give some new rules, some new regulations on how masters should treat slaves and what their rights could be.
Right. In fact, the whole story of Bible is a story of redemption from slavery to freedom. Be it for Israel in 400 years of bondage in Egypt, to their journey to the promised land, or to the mankind in general who became slaves to sin after the fall, and the greatest redemption act of God, sending his own son to redeem his people from darkness to marvelous light, as Colossians chapter 1 mentions, right? So God is always in the business of redeeming people and not the other way around. If you carefully read through the history of mankind, in fact, some of the greatest reformers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, etc., they quote Bible as their inspiration in their efforts towards abolition of slavery. I was reading an article the other day about Dr. King. In his final speech, which is titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," Dr. King compared himself to Moses, who saw the land God had promised the Israelites, but knew he wouldn't enter it. So if he actually dig deep, these reference to Numbers chapter 27, verse 12, and Deuteronomy 34. The same Torah, which is now referred as promoting slavery, is actually an inspiration to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is a champion of, for abolishing slavery in the West. And let's talk about our own, our father of a nation, Mahatma Gandhi, his famous line, show your other cheek. Where do you think that originated from? It's quoted from Matthew 5:39. So Bible in general, talking about the 66 books, they have been instrumental in inspiring great leaders to fight against slavery and oppression. And
that's right.
And since we're discussing about slavery, I would like to clarify something here, Shirin. According to Torah, there were 4 basic ways Hebrew might become a slave to another Hebrew, right? So
that's right.
Which is very clearly given in the scriptures. Leviticus mentions, Leviticus chapter 25 mentions, in extreme poverty, they might sell their liberty. And Exodus chapter 21 and verse 7 talks about a father may sell a daughter as a servant into a home with an intention
Yes.
that she would eventually marry into that family.
Family,
Here I
that's
would
right.
here I would like to highlight one thing. Never a daughter is sold into prostitution, nor the law prescribed this action. This is
That's
one of
right.
the misconceptions people need to be cleared of.
That's right.
And the other case where people, the Hebrew became a slave is in case of a bankruptcy. A man might
That's
become
right.
a servant to his creditors. Second Kings 4:1 says. And the last case is if a thief had nothing
That's
with
right.
which to pay proper restitution, then he becomes a slave, according to Exodus chapter 22 and verse 3. So,
That's
in
right.
each of these cases, we see that the intent of becoming a servant to someone else was to be employed and thereby able to live rather than die, right?
Exactly. That's
Right?
right.
Right. And when we come to Exodus 21, because that is the chapter
Yes.
of our discussion, right? For
That's
this
right.
question, God
Yes.
is, as you mentioned, God is setting rules and regulations on how to treat servants, which
That's
actually
right.
takes away the right of a master to deal with them as he likes.
That's right.
Like this in itself is an unbelievable precept in ancient culture where like there are
That's
no
right.
rights to slaves.
Yes.
And again, Exodus 21 and 2, we see that a servant was not bound forever to the master, right?
That's
But
right.
outmost for a
Yeah.
span of 6 years. So he
6 years.
was not the master's property rather than an intended labor, right,
That's
for a
right.
limited
That's
period
right.
of time. So he could get
That's
out
right.
free in the
Yes.
seventh year without paying
Correct.
anything, no matter how he became a slave in the first place.
First
I mean,
place. That's right.
which is referred to the year of jubilee, right? This
That's
kind
right.
of setting free of a slave was unheard of
Unheard of.
in the
That's
ancient
right.
times. So
That's true.
the rule of the time is that all slaves would rot and die at the master's mercy. But
That
here, the
is
God
right.
of the Torah, the God of Israel, gives these rules, and he brings in
Liberates them in a way.
liberates them, and he brings a
Liberates them.
novel concept, very
Correct.
new or unique in the ancient Near East. So
That's true.
by limiting the time of slavery, if we can use the word slavery,
Correct.
which means someone can be a slave only for 6 years,
That's
right?
right. That's
Uh,
right. No one
is
can be a slave more than that.
right,
That's right.
right.
But then again, the author does not mention it. That's, I mean, the author's intent is only to bring about a point that is convenient to make her conclusions. So
Yeah.
here the slave is only a slave for 6 years, and then he's free. He's free to go. So here in this particular context, she says that he cannot take his wife and children along with him. But then just, if you read the whole passage, we understand that if a slave came in as a married man, he already had a wife and family, then after 6 years, he could take them and go because he was allowed to keep his family that he had prior to becoming a slave. He could take his family with him when he went. So that is not talked about by the author here. The specific context of this verse 3 and 4, is that the slave came in, if I could say, as a bachelor. He was not married. And the master provides a family for him. I mean, that itself is, an interesting concept. A slave is being provided with a family, a wife, and probably children. And if the master provided them, then the master had the right to keep them with them because the master provided them to the slave, and the slave had to go. Now, the master cannot withhold anything from the slave that the slave had when he came. If he was married, his wife and children would go with him. But if he wasn't married and then the master provided a family, then the master rightfully could keep them back. Yeah, fair enough, could keep them back. But again, we see here, the slave has an option. If he loves his family, if he wants to be with his family, if he wants to be with his master, then and only then he could continue being a servant in that household. If you have to stay more than 6 years and continue being a servant, then you could do, and then you could stay with your family. So here, it all depends on the slave, what he wanted to do. Do you want to stay or do you want to go? Do you want to have a family or you want to be set free? Again, this is a revolutionary concept, isn't it? The master has no right to determine what the slave does. The slave has the choice and the liberty to decide for himself. That again is so contrary to the very concept of slavery, if we understand
Ancient
slavery
neighbors,
that was
yeah.
rampant there. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So we can conclude by carefully reading the text that Bible in no way supports slavery, but in fact,
That's right.
it created laws for those who are often without rights, and God also
That's right.
graciously provided them a means of freedom through
That's right.
various laws and regulations, right?
That's right. So
Okay.
the Bible is in fact, very the teachings of the Bible, or the laws in the Bible, are very crucial in eliminating slavery, not in establishing them.
It's
So
like,
that that we need to keep in mind when we look through the slavery laws, that this was in fact a way of eliminating slavery and not establishing them.
right, right. So there's a follow-up misconception to this with respect to slavery in Exodus 21:7, where the author mentions that God not only sanctions selling one's daughter into slavery, but he also gives out laws on how it should be done. I'll read Exodus chapter 27, verse 7 to 11. The author mentions, so that it will provide some clarity to the listeners. If a man sells his daughters to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do if she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself. And he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without money. That's what the text says, actually.
That's right. So this is just the follow-up text. So the previous question we dealt with verses 1 to 6 of 21. This is just attached to it, 7 to 11. So we first talked about a man being a slave. Here we talk about a woman being a slave. Now look at the distinction here. A woman could not become a slave unless she was betrothed with a promise to be married. And so see God's heart there. He's concerned about the well-being of this woman in this home. So she would ultimately become a family member. So she would be either betrothed to the master or the master's son, as this text implies. And then probably after a year, which was customary again for Jewish engagements, she would become the wife. Now, this context here is in case the master or his son did not take her to be wife after a certain period of time, then the word used is they have dealt deceitfully with her. So God considers it as deceit because she was taken with a promise of being married as a betrothed woman, but now she's not being married. In this case, what can be done? The master cannot just send her off saying that you are just a slave. He cannot sell her to any foreigner, but he has to treat her with dignity, provide for her everything that he would provide to a wife. And if the son was supposed to marry her, then she would now have the status of a daughter. It is clear in this text that you read the word custom of daughters. He should deal with her according to the custom of daughters. So now she has to be treated as a daughter. If not, she can be redeemed. She can be redeemed if none of these options work out, that she's not treated with the dignity as a wife nor a daughter. And if she's not redeemed, only then she can be set free without having to pay any amount of money. Because when she became betrothed, this master would have paid a bride price to the father of this girl. But now when she goes, she need not pay him back. She can just be set free. Again, giving liberty to the slave. So either the choice would be a dignified life in the master's home, like a family member, though she's not married, or she can be redeemed or set free. So that is the context in which this text appears.
Right. It might be a little off topic, but I'm struck by one word that you used. Bride price that the master pays. It's actually the opposite of the bride price which happens now in our own culture. It's the girl who pays the price to the bridegroom in our culture.
That's right.
And oh boy, the consequences of that happening in our culture right now, unfortunately. But in those days, it was the master who paid the bride price and brought the girl in, right?
That's right.
So even in today's modern age of feminism, Shireen, and whatnot, how many men walk out on engagements unscared,
That's right.
not being held responsible in any way, let alone care for the women who was wronged. And
That's right.
our society just holds its peace. And can you imagine how countercultural and
That's right.
normal this was in ancient culture, what you just discussed about this being betrothed to the master or the master's son and being treated as one of the daughters of the house, if not redeemed, with dignity. And this tells that God cares for the slave women whose engagement was
That's right.
called off, elevating her dignity to that of a family member. Beautiful,
That's
isn't it?
right. That's beautiful. Yes.
Yeah. So with this, we can wrap up our discussion on slavery in Torah, and with a underlying misconception that there is sexism in Torah. So we discussed about slavery, a male slave, a female slave, and what are the misconceptions the author has put. And I believe our explanation is sufficient to refute those claims. Then we will move on to the next section, where we will talk about polygamy. So this is a new section where we will be talking about Exodus chapter 21, and we would be dealing on this unknown author's statement on the evilbible.com in an article called Sexism in Torah, where she talks about a man taking several wives, and she says God ordains men taking several wives and even sets up laws to how multiple wives should be handled. Basically, she's talking about polygamy.
Yes. So in the Bible, if you see in the beginning of creation, when God made man and woman, God's original design, God's plan is one man and one woman in a covenantal relationship of marriage. God never ordained polygamy. He does not approve of polygamy. We see this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18 to 25, where God made Adam and God made one Eve for Adam. If God wanted polygamy, he could have made many women and brought them to Adam one after the other. But God does not do that.
Absolutely. I'm glad he didn't do that.
Yes. So marriage in the Bible is one man and one woman in a covenantal union, in a covenantal relationship. And again, Jesus Christ in Matthew 19, even in the context of the disciples or the Pharisees asking him about divorce and remarriage, even there, he quotes back to the original creation account where he says, it was not so. In the beginning, God made one man and one woman. So that is very clear. God's plan for marriage is not polygamy, but it is a one man, one woman relationship. But of course, the cultures of that time, the ancient cultures, even we see this in kings of Israel and Judah, they had multiple wives. So the Israelites, the Hebrews, they definitely had their share of influence from the culture. And we see in most of the men in the Bible, they had multiple wives. But this does not mean that God approved or condoned their behavior. It does not mean that that was God's plan for the family. It is clear when we come to the end of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, when the prophet Malachi accuses or brings out accusations against Israel. One chief accusation is that you have dealt treacherously with the wife of your covenant. No wives, but with the wife of your covenant. So there was one wife. It's one wife. So that's very clear both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. God never approved polygamy. And even these patriarchs or the people that we see who had multiple wives, they struggled because of it. There were family feuds, there were issues between children, issues between wives, and the effects of straying away from God's original design, we see clearly. When they did not keep the precepts of God and follow his design, and took multiple wives, they absolutely suffered the consequences of it. So we even see that. So the God of the Bible in no way condones polygamy.
Yeah, I mean, polygamy never had a positive effect on families in the Bible then, and is the same case now, right? It's not a good idea. I don't think anybody should even consider it. Well, we have discussed many misconceptions Shireen, all the way from the fall to polygamy right now. We have discussed
That's
about
right.
the claims of this unknown author, where she calls the God of the Bible a sexist pig, and Torah being sexist against women, from the account of the fall to Lot's family to Judah's family, and topics regarding slavery and polygamy.
Clearly.
However, as we
That's
discussed,
right.
all the arguments fell apart when we actually looked into the context and understood its original intent. And Chirin, till now, we both have tried to provide meaning behind the text. But before we wrap up, let's see what some of the statistics say. Let's look at some facts and figures for
Yes.
those who love numbers and stats. If you look at societies generally built on Judeo-Christian principles, we see that women are enjoying elevated status and equal opportunities when compared to other faiths. It's no secret. I recently came across an interesting statistic from our own Indian government website. It's called vikaspedia.in. And
Okay.
there is a sub-page over which talks about overview of minority communities in India. So let me read some interesting mentions from there. According to this government website, under the overview of minority communities in India, socio-economic status of minorities was one of the heading, where it mentions the literacy rate among persons of age 15 and above was the highest for Christians for both sexes, male and female, including the educational levels, secondary and above, standing highest in all the minorities in India.
Okay.
And another
Wow.
a fact that's mentioned there is LFPR, which is the labor force participation rate. In the urban female category, it was the highest for Christian females. And let's look at another parameter, work participation rate. Male-female differential in this WPR, which is work participation rate, was the lowest among Christians, which means the Christian females are enjoying a better equality and support from their community to outshine others. So this makes us think, if Torah or the Bible is so sexist against its women, why then the communities that adhere to Christian faith see this equality and progress among women? We have seen so many examples right around us. We can see examples if you're only willing to know the truth. So I want to remind the listeners
right.
of what Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 32. Then you will know the truth, and truth will set you free. May the Spirit of truth guide us all into that all truth. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and whoever believes in him will not die but have everlasting life. So, Shireen, it has been a wonderful time discussing with you these various topics, and I hope we both have provided enough of information and clarity to the listeners who would listen to this recording at a later point of time on understanding these misconceptions and clarifying them of the truths from the Bible. And it's our prayer that the truth would set them free. And so with this, goodbye till we meet again.